Good morning, Anne, and thank you very much for giving some time to the Mint to talk about the current crisis in global economic affairs.
Thank you so much for having me, Henry. This is lovely.
Brilliant. Well, it's really interesting how a lot of people have focused obviously on the trade war, and that seems to get most of the headlines.
Yeah.
You, I know, have been looking at the finance side, the other side of the equation, if you like.
Yes.
And that seems to be, and some people are saying it, and I think you believe as well, much more crucial actually to the future than the trade war side of things.
Sure. So the trade war, I mean, we think of it as simply being, putting up barriers against certain goods and services, but actually fundamentally, it's about inequality, and has been for a very long time. So the inequality at home is what is leading to the need to export essentially, and dump on other countries. So and this is a thesis that was first developed back in 1902 by J.A. Hobson, but also now promoted by Michael Pettis and Matt Klein in their book. So the point is this, that economies have been encouraged by the IMF, the World Bank, by the kind of economic ideology that is dominant, that really the most important thing to do to expand your economy is to export. And so export sectors have been given special privileges. They've been given massive subsidies on the whole. And the people engaged in export activity tend to be the 1%, tend to be those better off. So if you think of China and China's export sector, that the dominant export region is the coast, and people living along the coast tend to be far better off than people living inland, the peasants who really are struggling. And the same applies in Britain, and of course it applies in the United States, where the Rust Belt and all those people who'd lost their jobs to Chinese imports are part of the losers in this game, whereas Wall Street and the financial system have been massive gainers because the Chinese and other exporters into the United States have used their earnings from exports to buy up financial assets and American financial assets. And that could be derivatives, it could be stocks and shares, it could be all kinds of bonds. It is, of course, particularly treasury bonds. That strengthened the dollar, and it strengthened the American economy. And it meant that the dollar was strong, which also cheapened imports. So, the Americans were doing pretty well out of this until they just realized that actually their economy had been emaciated, actually, and that lots of people were losers. Excuse me. But the same applies elsewhere, essentially. Anyway, the point is, what we're seeing happen now is that the Americans are trying to reverse this process and doing it in a very straight, clumsy way, if you like, by just simply putting up barriers to trade. And they're not doing anything at the moment about the money that's going into Wall Street, essentially, the gains that are going into Wall Street. In other words, there are no capital controls, although in President Trump's big, beautiful bill, what he calls that, there is a clause which calls for controls over inward flowing capital into the United States. Whether that survives the progress of the bill is a question to be asked. But the fact of the matter is they're beginning to think about limiting the degree to which foreigners can buy financial assets. Now, when that happens, the dollar weakens. And the dollar has been weakening since the beginning of this year, and it's quite extraordinary. It's almost unprecedented, because the dollar, usually when it has higher rates, and if you look at the interest rates in the United States, they are higher than they are, for example, in Europe, in the ECB. What normally and they're much higher. They are higher than they may be, for example, in poor countries, low-income countries. And what happens is that capital leaves low-income countries, low-interest rate countries, and floods across to the United States. strengthening the dollar. Now, this is for the first time ever, this process is reversed. Capital is not flowing to the higher rates available in the United States. They're flowing into Switzerland in particular, strengthening the Swiss franc, but also into the euro. So we're seeing this financial system being disrupted as well as the trading system.
Yeah, just is it true then? I mean, there were certain reports that the trade pause in the war that Trump did was really due to the worries about what was happening in the bond market.
That's right. So what happened was, because people realized the dollar was weakening, and the dollar was weakening partly because people were saying, oh, can you trust US Treasury bills? Can you trust the United States to honor its obligations to repay its debts? There was an awareness that there might be inflation in the United States. And so people began to sell treasuries, American bonds. After Liberation Day, when Trump made that extreme announcement, that's when bond investors really became very anxious and started to sell their assets. And the more they sold their assets into the market, the lower the price of bonds, the more. And the problem with that is that people had used the value of a bond, of a treasury bill, as an asset, as a collateral against which to borrow additional money. Right? So when your collateral devalues, when your bond falls in value, and this was what was happening as people were selling treasury bills, your debt that you've leveraged rises relatively. We know that. If we bought a house, there are people who lived through 1989 when when our mortgages, when our properties were falling in value, so we couldn't sell them relative to our mortgages. That's pretty well what's happening with bonds. People were worried about the amount of debt they'd leveraged against these assets which were falling in value. And then the US Secretary of the Treasury warned Trump this was happening and that it was very dangerous, and he began to cool it, really. I noticed the other thing he's doing is attacking the governor of the Federal Reserve and demanding that interest rates come down. What that is doing is showing that the government is trying to undermine the independence of the Federal Reserve. And yesterday, he renewed his attack on Jerome Powell and called for lower rates. Now, I don't know if you remember, but Turkey did the same. Erdogan did the same to the Turkish Central Bank. And that ended in disaster because what happens is capital loses confidence in the central bank and it just accelerates outward flows. So really, this is a tragic story, but it all starts with inequality. And when J.A. Hobson was writing about this in 1902, he was writing about South Africa. And that means a lot to me because I'm South African born, as you know. And he was the Guardian's correspondent in South Africa, and he watched Cecil John Rhodes. Now, Cecil John Rhodes was using Britain's surplus capital to invest in cheap land, cheap labor, and cheap markets, if you like, in South Africa. But at the same time, that capital was not being invested in Britain. It wasn't being invested in raising standards of living here at home. And so what happened was, that imbalance, that inequality grew because all of those around the City of London investing in South Africa and India and all the colonies were doing supremely well as long as they could expand their markets. And people back home were doing really badly. And Hobson argued that was a problem because it was the problem of inequality. Now, we may have strong moral views about inequality, but there's a macroeconomic dimension to this as well, which is that if you depress incomes at home and you increase the incomes of the 1%, you end up with the problem of underconsumption. And this is a long way round to getting to the green aspect of this crisis, which is that we have a crisis here now of overproduction. And we know it as we go into the shops and you can buy 3 bottles of shampoo for 1 and all that nonsense. But more than anything, we have gluts of stuff that's being produced. But we have the inability of the people at home, in the United States, in China, and in Britain and Europe, to consume all that stuff. They can't afford to buy it because their incomes are low. So income inequality results in underconsumption and overproduction. And overproduction is the problem that we have with the environment, because we're extracting assets from the sea, we're stripping forests, we're emptying the seas, we're degrading the land to churn out stuff, and it's not being consumed. So the dimensions of this trade crisis is really quite extraordinary, and we ought to pay attention to it. Sorry, that was quite a long way around.
Well, can I just take you back to the bonds, US bonds, and what's going to happen with that, particularly around the dollar's position as the reserve currency and so on. And one of the key things, isn't it, if I'm right, is some of the biggest holder of these bonds are the Chinese.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
and the Japanese,
could there be what are the potential for a major sort of destabilization of the sort of currency system that we're currently relying on? And what happens then? If the dollar is no longer seen as a safe haven, where do we go? Who is safe, and what does that mean for the whole financial system?
Well, that is the threat we face, essentially. Now, the Chinese can't afford to sell their bonds because that lowers the value of the bonds, and it's a form of self-harm, if you like. They have a vested interest in that strong dollar and in those financial assets. But they've now got a problem because for example, I was listening on the radio this morning to the story of steel. They've been selling steel to the United States and using the financial gains from that to invest in bonds. Now the United States has put up this massive barrier. So what's happening? The steel has to go somewhere else. China has to do something with all of those exports that are piling. This is where we get to the overproduction and to the gluts. So they're dumping them, for example, on Britain. So this morning on the radio, where the British steel makers say, hang on, we're having to pay 25% on tariffs on American selling into the United States. But in the meantime, by the back door, the Chinese are dumping their surplus steel on us. So the demand this morning was, please, government, put up barriers against the Chinese. So we have a problem here where the global trading system might collapse when everybody will be forced by, just the reality. Just you can't resist women. It's steel, it's beef, it's all kinds of other areas of the British economy that are fundamental to our survival. And so the government's going to have to become more protectionist. And that's not just Britain, that'll be Europe, that'll be most of Africa. Africa should try and do that. And it'll be Latin America and, of course, the United States. Then the question becomes, what happens to the value of the dollar? And the dollar will be weakening anyway, regardless of whether or not the Chinese hold on to their treasury bills or not. And everyone is thinking about alternatives, and they're all thinking about an alternative currency. And would that be the euro, or will it be the renminbi, the Chinese currency? In reality, I'm arguing that we have to listen at last to John Maynard Keynes.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And we have to develop an international clearing union, which enables us to trade and maintain balance in trade with our partners, with our partner countries, without having to need any currency, not even the thing he called the Bancor. You don't even need that. You sell into the market, you sell into the clearing union your soya beans, and you make a profit, you build up a surplus. And I'm Malawi, say, and I buy your soya beans and I build up a deficit. And the whole point about the clearing union is that sitting in the middle is something like a central bank. And the central bank say, well, you've got a surplus and I'm going to discipline you for that. You've got to reduce your surplus by buying Malawian maize, and you, Malawi, have got to improve your deficit by selling more Malawian maize into the country that sold you soya beans. So what that does is to force countries to trade with each other properly, but also to maintain balance. Now, that idea was killed off by the Americans and by a British economist, Dennis Robertson, at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. But, Keynes had worked on the idea from the early 1940s precisely because exactly the same thing had happened in the 1930s. We'd had the same build-up in inequality. We'd had the same build-up in surpluses and deficits. We'd had the same problem with sterling as a reserve currency. And the sterling's role had to be maintained at a very high level, which harmed Britain's exports and caused unemployment at home. He could see all the problems with the reserve currency and had an alternative. And he wasn't heard. He wasn't listened to. And that was one of the biggest mistakes of the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference.
But I suppose you could see why that sort of makes sense, but it also doesn't it imply a major shift of power to some sort of international organization and the requirement for all the different countries to get together, talk nicely to each other and agree on such a mechanism.
No, exactly.
There's not a lot of nice talking to each other going on, I feel.
No, you've hit the nail on the head there, Henry. That's the most improbable part of the story. We don't have a world leader who could play a role in bringing people together in the way that Roosevelt did in the we're going to need, I'm afraid, to have another catastrophic war before we suddenly realize again that really what is important is that we should be working in a coordinated and cooperative way as nations and not in this hostile way of building up trade tensions and with it other tensions, political tensions. But the point is this, there is an institution, it's called the Bank for International Settlements. And it's a little bit like, it is the granddaddy central bank of all central banks. It's where all the central banks gather to share data and so on and so forth. And they are an institution that could play this role. The IMF couldn't play this role because the IMF is too discredited, is too politicized, and the World Bank can't play the role. The UN can't play this role, but the BIS could play the role. And the reason I agree with you that it's so improbable at the moment, but what is probable is smaller regional clearing unions. And we know that because after the Second World War, Europe developed a clearing union. And they did that because in Europe, what happened after the war was the Americans said, oh, don't worry, we'll send you the Marshall Plan. We'll send you loads of US dollars. And by the way, you can buy American machinery and American kit with your US dollars. And so that suited the Americans really well, but it didn't help the Europeans begin to build their own economies. When, with the advice of the economist Robert Triffin, they decided to develop their own clearing union where they traded with each other and they managed the surpluses and deficits. They began to develop their own economies and they began the whole process of recovery. Now, unfortunately, it only lasted, I think, for 5 or 6 years, was hugely successful and then dismantled by effectively Wall Street and the City of London and the free marketeers and so on. But it is evidence of how this could work. And I'm currently arguing that the Africans should do this. They should set up a clearing union because that would, their dependence on the dollar has been really harmful to their interests and so on.
And what about, yes, I keep going back, I suppose, to China, because as you say, they've suddenly got all these surpluses that they're trying to dump. And we know, don't we, that China has had various bumps in their economy and are highly dependent on keeping their growth rates up to keep the population sort of...
Yeah, they can't afford a social uprising.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, obviously they have the huge crisis with the housing market.
Yeah.
And then, as far as I understand it, they've gone to try moved into renewable energy and electric vehicles, but
Yeah.
then they've got an overproduction probably of that as well, and a feedback. And now, with steel, etc., etc. I mean, if everyone's going to say, well, we can't take this overproduction from China, I mean, what is China going to do?
Well, that's the real question. This is where the collapse of the international trading system seems to me to be an inevitability. The only thing China can do is divert her excess production, her exports, to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world, and she's doing that already. According to the people on the Radio 4 this morning, steel is already being dumped here, right? She's now going to have to shift all of that stuff in order to keep her rates of production going, in order to keep her people employed and happy. Either that or complete reversal. Now, China is capable, it seemed to me, the Chinese are capable of becoming world leaders in a sense. Because first of all, they do understand and they don't deny the climate crisis and the fact that we're breaking planetary boundaries in all respects. They understand that pretty well, and they're beginning to transform their economy as a result of that. I mean, clean energy will soon become really, fundamental to China. They could play a very progressive and leadership role in the world, but it would mean they would have to begin to seriously reorient their economy back into the domestic economy, which is really underused and it's an underconsumption economy, essentially. And that's because, for example, the welfare state in those rural areas is not developed. People can't afford to buy stuff, and they can't afford to take risks because they don't have mortgages, they don't have assets, and they don't have income, essentially. So China's going to have to make that massive change back towards the domestic economy. Now, she's capable of doing that. They are, it's a top-down economy. What if they were to, but they have been trying and they've struggled. They are aware they have to do that.
I mean, this goes back a long way, doesn't it? The issue
Yeah.
of so-called Chinese underconsumption. I
Yes.
mean, 20 odd years,
Even beyond that. So when you think before, they joined the WTO, that would have been a problem. But the fact was, before they joined the WTO, the orientation was still on the Chinese economy. To be honest, we've got to all do that. The British economy is also hopelessly distorted. It's hopelessly unequal, and it's also hopelessly distorted. Our exports tend to be service sector exports. They tend to be the City of London's exports. We depend on the City of London selling insurance and all kinds of other financial assets, in order to be able to buy iPhones. We've got a massive trade imbalance, and we live with that trade imbalance by depending on foreigners buying the City of London's assets. We've got to change that too.
Well, I suppose in China, you could say that the whole housing, all that spending on housing and new cities and railways and infrastructure was pushing local consumption. But that ended in tears, didn't it?
It did, because, I mean, if you talk to Keynes, you've got to employ people and you've got to employ them at decent wages in order to earn the revenues that can be used to pay for the investment. And we're back to, China needs skilled, huge employment, not just on the coast, but internally, and at decent levels of income so people can raise their living standards. And then the question becomes also, can you do that within the limits of the biosphere?
Yeah.
And that's the other challenge that they face, which is why they're buying up land in Africa and so on and so forth, in order to, they worry about that. They can see that they're going to exhaust their own resources pretty soon.
And I suppose the current crisis with Trump, well, could trigger them to take drastic action
Yes.
in a way that they haven't maybe previously to such extent.
Yeah, but we're all going to be affected by it. We're all going to, I mean, what Trump is doing is basically destabilizing the whole of the global economy, and we really don't know how to respond. And then there's the small matter of Russia and
Oh, yes.
and what that's doing to diverting valuable resources into destructive activity, essentially. You know, the Ministry of Defense is going to raise a lot of money, but the ministry for the biggest insecurity we face, which is the climate breakdown, that's not being financed. You know, Ed Miliband can't settle his budget with the Treasury.
I heard this morning that he had managed to get his way, but
Right. Okay.
we will see. Well, this has been really interesting. I don't think we're going to end up with any conclusions at this point, are we? Because things are moving, and how they're going to play out is hugely uncertain, but quite terrifying, I think.
They are. I'm afraid I'm somewhat pessimistic about the outcomes, really, mainly because I don't see the intellectual and the political leadership, really, for dealing with these issues. We don't have, mainly we've hollowed out our political systems. You know, when you think about our parliament, the parliament used to have political power over the supply of water, over the supply of, over the broadcasting, over BBC broadcasting, over housing, all kinds of things. And now our parliamentarians been stripped of all that. So we have hollow parliaments and hollow politicians, essentially. And so we aren't growing the kind of political leadership needed to deal with these threats. And I think that's a big worry.
Well, thank you very much for that overview. And I look forward to reading your book. What's your book? What's the title? Have you got it?
It's called The Global Casino, and it relies very heavily on the work of Susan Strange, who worked very much in the financial system. And it's about how we don't know what's going on out there in relation to our pensions, to our food supply, to our energy supply, and even if to housing, because most of the markets for that are global markets, globalized markets, and they're largely deregulated. And that's a really big worry because there's quite a lot of speculation and all kinds of other dodgy things going on out there without the rule of law necessarily restraining people. So I'm just concerned that the woman in the street should be able to understand that and talk about it and discuss it, you know, because the economists talk about it in such a way as to make it impossible to make sense, really.
Absolutely. Well, when it's out, hopefully you might have a moment to come back and talk about your book and also update, you know, on this ongoing
story
crisis that we face.
Thanks so much, Henry. I look forward to it, and good luck with Mint. It's I'm proud to have been around at the beginning.
You were a great supporter. Thank you very much, Anne, and let's talk again soon.
Thank you. Bye.